Sure. Thanks, everyone. My name is Ellen Morris, and I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, leading up their University Partnerships program. And I'm really happy to have my colleague, Juan Torres, today speaking to you. And Juan is the Associate Lab Director for Energy Systems Integration, and he leads the lab's efforts on the Energy System Integration Facility to strengthen the security and resilience of our electrical grid. He also leads NREL's global initiative to optimize the links between electricity, fuel, thermal, water, and communication networks to enable us to develop and demonstrate new technologies in modernizing the grid. And Juan has been at NREL for 3 years, and he came to NREL from another national laboratory, the U.S. Department of Energy's Sandia National Laboratory, as an electrical engineer, where he had several management positions and was most recently there the deputy to the vice president for energy and climate. So I'm really happy to have Juan as a colleague here, and he and I and the other folks from NREL who are on this webinar are very keen to really think about the lab in terms of underrepresented groups and diversity and inclusion, and how we can start to build our workforce. So one of the efforts in doing that that connects into my world is on university partnerships, and CU, University of Colorado in particular, which is one of our flagship partners in terms of research, teaching, and student and faculty exchanges. So I'll turn it over to Juan now, and I'll come in after Juan's presentation to help provide some further insights into our university partnerships program. So Juan, take it away.
Thank you, Ellen. And thanks to Jorge and the leadership there at CU Boulder's SHPE, Mayas, and 7 organizations. I think it's exciting for me to always it's always exciting for me to speak to students. I think I get a lot more out of it because I learn a lot from some of the questions that you all have. But you know, the really big thing for me is the reason I like doing this is because I believe that it's important to give back. It's important to provide some mentoring. It's important to provide some sense of the possible, because I don't believe I had that, you know, growing up. Now, I've titled my talk here kind of a personal journey toward transforming energy, because I really want to talk a little bit about my personal story and how I got to where I am at NREL. But I also want to spend some time, you know, educating and informing about what does NREL do. You know, growing up in Colorado, I had no idea NREL, or its predecessor, I guess in my day, was called SERI, even existed. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's see. So a little bit more about my background. I actually grew up in Mexico. So in a city called León, Guanajuato, the state of Guanajuato. It's in central Mexico. And my family moved up to the States when I was 4 years old. So I came to the U.S. As an immigrant and learned English as a second language. And we settled in an area of Colorado called La Junta, or as we called it in my household, La Junta, which is the proper pronunciation. It's down in the Arkansas Valley. Those of you, let's see, on there at CU may or may not know where La Junta is, right? So, you know, my goal today is try to inspire, inform, and entertain. So you'll have to be the judge of whether I inspire and entertain. At a minimum, I'll inform you here. This part of Colorado, most people don't know it's even part of the state, right? It's down in a farming valley. It's well known for, some of you may know Rocky Ford cantaloupes and Rocky Ford melons. That area is well known for farming. And you know, growing up in a small town, I just did not have a whole lot of guidance. I did not know anybody with a technical background except for my dad, who worked in a factory and kind of taught himself. He became an apprentice in Mexico when he was really young, and at some point learned how to repair some TVs and radios. But both of my parents only went to, my dad went to first grade and my mom went to third grade. So for me, everything was first time. I was the first in my family to go to elementary school, first to go to high school and graduate. I would say I didn't have super great counseling, so I didn't know what I was going to do. Somewhere along the line, I decided, you know, I really like science and math, but I thought I was going to be an artist. And I only chose kind of a technical path because I wanted to get out of poverty, and I didn't want to be a starving artist. But I didn't know where to go. What do you do? What schools do I go to? I had never been on a college campus until my senior year. We made a visitation to CU Boulder and CSU as part of the Honor Society. And even there, I mean, it was still, I just thought there's no way I can ever go to a place like either one of these schools. So that's just kind of the background where I started from. So because I didn't have a whole lot of guidance, I wandered aimlessly in some cases about where to go, what to do. I spent a year out of high school. I went to in Phoenix at DeVry because they had a program there that I thought I could get a degree in 3 years, a bachelor's degree, and get a good paying job. And back in 1985, which is when I got out of high school, engineers were making about 30 grand a year. That was a lot of money back then, 30 grand. I mean, it was huge. Teachers were making about $14,000 back then. So 30 grand was a heck of a lot. Today, you can barely survive on 30 grand. I stayed there a year, didn't really like the curriculum. It was too structured. Phoenix was too hot. I moved back to La Junta, right, and stayed with my parents for a year. And we had a local junior college, and I picked up a few more courses. One of the biggest challenges is I didn't have money for school. So I worked 2 jobs. During OJC, I was working 60, 70 hours a week. It was really challenging. I didn't know how to get scholarships. I didn't have a lot of guidance there. I applied for Pell Grants, things like that. I did things the hard way, and I guess the benefit out of that is it builds character, is what they tell me. Or you become a character. I don't know, one of those. Eventually I transferred after my, so by this point I had already been in college for 2 years. I said, where am I going to go? I thought about CSU, studying engineering maybe there. And eventually I settled on what was then University of Southern Colorado. It's now CSU Pueblo. And they had an engineering technology program, which was similar to the program I started at DeVry. It just happened by chance that I ran into a company that was hiring there my junior year or after my junior year, and I found out it turned out to be Sandia Labs. I asked, hey, this is a really good place. What do you guys expect from your recruits? What kind of people are you hiring? They said, well, people with technical types of backgrounds, high GPAs. But we require U.S. citizenship, and I was not a citizen, and so that really motivated me. I grew up, in the school system here, yet I started to find out I did not have all of the rights that a U.S. citizen had. I couldn't vote, and in this case, I couldn't work for Sandia because they require security clearance. So I applied. I applied for citizenship, and had to go through everything, the testing, and through the process to become a citizen. So that was a huge deal for me. I was the first in my family to get citizenship. My parents hadn't applied for it. So, I was very fortunate. My first position out of my undergrad, I went to Sandia Labs, and I found out through my advisor there at University of Southern Colorado, Sandia was one of the most well-respected engineering organizations in the world. Their mission was around national security. They're located in Albuquerque. You know, it was just, they said they only take the top students. So I took that position at Sandia, but one of the first things I found out immediately is to work at a national laboratory. It was almost fundamental. You got to have a graduate degree. I went in basically as a technician with a bachelor's degree, especially in a bachelor's in engineering technology, as opposed to, you know, straight engineering. It was more applied, less theoretical. And so first thing I did is I applied to graduate school. I applied to the University of New Mexico and got into their master's program in electrical engineering. Finished up my degree on my own. You know, they had a program that covered my tuition, but basically I was just doing it on my own time. I was taking 2 graduate classes a semester. Those of you that are thinking about graduate school, I would say every class in graduate school is about 1.5 times the amount of work of an undergraduate course. So it was pretty heavy load. It was not at least taking 9 hours of undergraduate equivalent. And so knocked out the degree on my own time there. Eventually, at some point, about 7 years later, I thought about a doctorate, and I actually got into Stanford, started on a doctoral program in electrical engineering, and put it on hold, though, for a while, because at that point, I had 2 young children, and I had to make a decision as well. I had an opportunity to move into management, where, you know, the research background wasn't as necessary. And I made a call, and actually, for me, it was the right call. And I still am holding that. At some point, I may go back and finish, you know, my doctoral degree. But that's some of my background, so you know where I came from. I spent 27 years there, working in a lot of different things, from defense, design of defense systems for fighting a nuclear war, to cybersecurity, to critical infrastructure protection, to microgrids, and I managed the renewables program there for about 7 years as a senior manager before I became deputy to the vice president for our energy programs there. And I joined NREL because it was the right place and the right time for me in my career. I was not looking for a move, and it became, it was great to come back to Colorado, number one. But secondly, it was a way to continue having big impact in the energy area, which is one of my big passions. So, you know, at NREL, we are one of the younger laboratories. You know, we started as the Solar Energy Research Institute back in the late 70s. Started at just a few hundred people. Now we are actually close to 3,000 people. These numbers are a little outdated, but they give you a sense of the size of the laboratory. We're one of the younger and one of the smaller laboratories. I will say I call us a large small lab, but we were one of the most focused lab, and I would say one of the most impactful laboratories. When I was at Sandia, there was 14,000 people there. Although their core mission is nuclear weapons, they do energy and homeland security work and things like that. One of the things I struggled with when I was there is I really wanted to continue working in energy, but energy wasn't the primary mission. It was like fourth order down as far as the mission focus. So it was really nice to come to a laboratory where that is the mission. Our mission is energy. We do quite a bit with industry and other external partners, and which then, you know, that brings in a lot of people from the commercial side. We do quite a bit with utilities, with the big vendors. We work with GE, we work with ExxonMobil. You know, even the fossil companies are coming to us because they're finding they're not fossil energy companies, they're energy companies, and they know the future has to go beyond fossil. They know that they have to figure out how they're going to survive long term, working in other areas like renewables, like energy storage, and how that's going to support the future energy infrastructure. These are the four kind of core areas that four major thrust areas we work in. Our history is in renewable power, but that's not all who we are. As a NREL, historically, it stands for the National Renewable Energy Lab. But if you saw on the very first slide I showed you, our tagline is transforming energy. Okay, so we're NREL, and we transform energy. We're the ones making the biggest change to our energy infrastructure from a government investment perspective. And so we don't own the energy infrastructure. We have to work with the owners and the operators. In the renewables area, we're breaking records in solar cell efficiency. We work in solar panels. We work on new materials like perovskites. We work on wind technology, everything from improving the overall reliability and power output of individual wind turbines. So on the material side, as well as the system side, how do you make these systems smarter and be able to produce more power as a system? We work in other areas like water power, geothermal, but also things like hydrogen. So for the most part, most aspects of non-fossil and non-nuclear energy technologies. There are other labs that focus on those areas. A good question for all of you, and I know you're not able to necessarily respond right now. Do you know how many DOE labs there are? There are 17 Department of Energy national laboratories. Some of those laboratories are focused on weapons. Some of them are focused on science research. There are only 3 national labs focused specifically on energy, applied energy, I should say. NREL focused on renewable energy. The Idaho National Lab's mission is actually on nuclear energy, and the National Energy Technology Lab is mission around fossil energy. Those are the three applied energy laboratories out of the 17. Remember Sandia, where I worked, in Los Alamos, and some of those are actually nuclear weapons laboratories. We work in transportation. Also, this includes electric vehicles, things like autonomous vehicles, and so on. We work in energy efficiency, so it's not just how you generate and store energy and move energy, but also, can you make our energy use? Can you reduce the energy use and make systems more efficient? And in the energy systems integration, that's my core area. We do a lot of work in high performance computing and analysis and simulation. And then I lead the work in security and resilience, so cybersecurity and increasing resilience of our energy infrastructure. And we do quite a bit around the power grid, and I'll spend a little time on that because that is the core to our area. This building behind, on the back of the, or at the top of the slide here, that is the Energy Systems Integration Facility. It's the only facility of its kind. It's what's considered a user facility under the Department of Energy, 180,000 square feet, built for $130 million. It is a flagship facility at NREL. I've had the privilege of, since that falls under my program space, giving a lot of tours for VIPs. I've given tours there to the Secretary of Energy, to other VIPs within the government, as well as to the head of another foreign government. I'll say the president of another country that we didn't publicize very broadly, but that's the kind of work that we do, and that's the kind of impact that we have. Our work in energy is far-reaching. It's global. We're seen as a leader in energy around the globe. So it's not just the U.S. We are seen as a leader globally. I'll bring this slide up only just to point out, where things are evolving over time. You'll see here that, since 2010 up to where we are, more or less 2020, there's a trend here. In blue, more natural gas. It's cheap, It's low carbon emitting, and we have a pretty strong supply of natural gas in the U.S. Coal is on a decline for a variety of reasons. A lot of people just are not big fans of it. It's dirty. It's a challenge to dig out, and so on. And the reality is we don't have an unlimited supply of coal. At some point, maybe it's 200 years from now, and there's been some studies around that. At some point, we will run out of coal, and it's not the healthiest for our environment either. Nuclear, for the most part, remains steady. We're not really commissioning any new nuclear power plants. So expect, though, that nuclear power will continue to be in our portfolio here in the U.S. Renewables really fall into two categories. One is the non-hydro, and then there's hydro. Hydro are dams, essentially, but it can also include some of the newer areas like marine hydrokinetics, so wave and tidal energy. Non-hydro, that's going to be your solar and your wind and all the other types of renewables. And you'll see those are on actually a fairly steep incline in use in the U.S. That's important to note because that's changing the face of energy. If you look at where we use energy, you can't have a consistent policy across the U.S. because not everybody has the same resource. In the upper left on the image here, this is more or less the layout of the transmission line, the electric grid transmission line infrastructure across the U.S. And that basically moves the electrons from the generation source to the end users for large plants. We'll talk about in a minute how that's changing. On the upper right, this is the wind power resource. The darker the shade of blue, the more wind is available. So you'll see it's kind of the Midwest is where most of the wind energy actually resides. And then you go to the lower images on the lower left. Those are the rivers, essentially. That's the hydropower resource. You're limited on hydropower to where the water is, right? And in the Southwest, we struggle with water. We don't have a lot of water out here. If you're up in the Northwest, up in the Oregon, Washington State area, then they do really well. They have a lot of hydropower. Now look at solar. We're actually pretty wealthy when it comes to solar energy. You can see it's mostly in the Southwest. You can get solar up in the Northeast. You can get solar in Vermont and so on. You struggle a little bit more when you have a lot of snow hanging around on your solar panels year round. You got to go over and sweep those off. But we do have some folks out there that actually use quite a bit of solar. So when we look at what is the best approach for the U.S., my answer usually is, well, it depends. The biggest growth of population continues to be on the east and west coasts, right? So that's where more of the people going. So that's where more of the load is going. But when you look at this, most of the solar is in the Southwest and the wind is in the center of the country. That means you need these transmission lines to move it there. Or in some cases, can you use some of your own local smaller generation? Okay. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with how the power grid operates, and I'll only hit on a couple of things here, but the grid is designed and it's set up with all these different regions, these different areas, and there are operators and transmission line operators and balancing authorities, and it's actually much more complex and a big patchwork of how we operate the grid than most people realize. There are three major grids in the U.S., and what that means is within each of these major grids, the WEC, the Western Electric Coordinating Council, for example, which is where Colorado resides, we basically try to maintain a consistent frequency across that entire area. 60 hertz is what you usually hear, right? 60 hertz signal for a power grid. So across the Western grid, we maintain our own frequency. On the Eastern grid, similar, you have all these regions, but they all essentially are synchronized at 60 hertz. It's in phase, over on their side. Texas is its own grid, ERCOT, and so they keep that 60 hertz and lock into whatever phase that they use there. So the grid is designed to island off in those sections. Power actually flows between those three major grids, but it is then it's usually through DC ties, direct current. So then you can basically recreate the frequency, tie it to whatever frequency you've got locally. It gives you a little bit of background at a very, very high level on the grid, where we see things going in the future. You can find some of these studies on our website if you go to NREL.gov. We've been doing a lot of electrification future studies. So how is the use of electricity going to change in the future? That will drive how our grid will evolve over time. If you look in the upper left, this is a base case reference. Red is the industrial load, how we foresee it growing over the next 30 years or so. It's growing steady, but for the most part, not significantly. It's mostly flat. The orange is residential, and the green is commercial. This is kind of a reference base case. If we go as a business as usual, as we're growing our loads are actually more efficient. We're using a lot more LED lighting. We're using more energy efficient construction. So even though the population is growing, and like I said, mostly on the coast, it's much more energy efficient. Now we're looking at other scenarios, and we'll look in the upper right. What you'll see here is this blue slice. That's transportation. So depending on where policies go, depending on where prices of electric vehicles go, this could be a huge load on our power grid, transportation, for electric vehicles. We're already seeing not just for residential, individual consumer use, but also for trucking. Okay, the fleet the fleet industry, most of their driving is 200 miles or less, and they're starting to move toward electrification of some of those vehicles. Well, where do you charge, and how do you charge? And if you go to really fast charging, which is what most people would like, most people don't want to spend any more time charging their vehicle than they do putting gas in it, right? And right now, that's not how we charge it. People charge it overnight at their home and things like that. But we can go to extremely fast charging, and that could have a significant impact on the grid and how we architect the grid of the future. The scenario down on the lower right, that shows an extreme scenario where electrification of transportation really, really takes off. So that could have a significant impact. I don't know if you can see the animation on this very well. Is it good? Can you tell that things are moving on there?
Yeah.
Okay. This is it includes the western grid in the light gray on the left. The eastern grid is the dark gray. Notice something that I didn't really point out earlier. Our grid is not a U.S. grid. Our grid is a North American grid, so it extends all the way up into Canada. So what happens in Canada affects us too. Okay? This does not include the Texas grid, ERCOT. We just didn't have data for it at that time. But this is what we're forecasting is one scenario. This is 5-minute increments. You'll see here in a second, there's this darkness that kind of goes from right to left, and you see these blue circles. That's wind. Wind tends to blow at night. So wind energy, this is where we're projecting wind energy will be located. Then you see here, this is the sun coming up. It gets lighter, and you see all these yellow circles. Those are solar resources, and those in the day then will be one of the bigger sources of energy. These kaleidoscope, circles on the lower left and right. The one on the lower right essentially is showing all these little names around the perimeter are different regions. They're also named here on the map. And energy is flowing between the different regions. And depending on the time of day where you might have more energy in one area that's needed up in another area that doesn't have as much, you could see the direction of the energy flows actually change over time. And you'll see the width of these lines, these colors get wider in some areas, they get narrower. that gives you a sense of the amount of energy flow. So these are some of the models we developed to help us get an understanding of where of how we might architect and place electricity generation and where transmission might be needed. But one of the things I didn't point out earlier, we're kind of constrained on how many more big power lines we can put in. It's very expensive, millions and millions of dollars. And a lot of times where we need to build them, there are national parks, there are tribal lands, and those become huge challenges. So what's happening essentially is that we're moving toward putting power closer to the consumer. If we can't build these big solar plants or solar farms or new nuclear plants or new natural gas plants, in some cases where we really want to be able to supply multiple areas, maybe we ought to put electricity near the consumer. And so this diagram here shows how things normally have flowed historically. I mean, the grid is over 100 years old, and it's a very simple concept. Those of you guys, it sounds like all you guys are studying, the students here studying engineering or something, you know that electrons flow and how they move. And essentially with the big power plants, like what we have on the left, you have a giant magnet, you spin it in a circle by, you heat some water using either a nuclear reaction or you burn coal or you burn natural gas. You heat water, it makes steam. The steam turns a turbine. The turbine basically turns a big magnet. That magnet pushes electrons down these big transmission lines and they flow to your house. That's historically how things have worked. Where things are today, now we've added things like energy storage. We've added now variable generation like wind farms and solar. But where things are really changing is down at the edge of the grid. Okay, and that's the substation that you have down the street from you, where you've got a big transformer behind a fence usually. That is now, it has bidirectional power flow because you can generate electricity down at your home, or at the Home Depot down the street might have solar panels on it. So now your electricity flow is bidirectional. That's causing us to relook at how we put in protection for these systems. And then you have all these new devices like, here, like these smart appliances, home energy management systems, and so on. And I mentioned things like transportation systems and charging. And one key theme here is everything is managed through information systems. So how does this open up vulnerabilities on the cybersecurity side? That's a huge challenge, and that's one that we at the laboratory are working on. One of the other things that's changing here is how we're moving from you guys have taken physics, I think, most of you, or I'm hoping all of you, but somewhere even in high school, you probably learned about inertia, right? The tendency for something to continue to keep moving. It's based on the amount of mass. And given that the grid is basically based on, or historically, generation of electricity was based on movement, spinning of a big magnet, it's a big mass. So the grid is basically an electromechanical system. But what happens when you don't have a turbine and a generator? What happens when you have solar panels where there's no moving parts? Or even when you have wind turbines where you are doing things a little bit different, where you're using electromechanical here, but you actually have an inverter here, a piece of power electronics, where you're actually managing the electrons getting on the grid. And many of you have seen, you're all moving toward LED lights in your homes. They're more expensive, but they last longer and they're much more energy efficient overall. This is becoming the standard in all the new construction is LED lighting. If you've ever opened one of these up, there are integrated circuits in there, right? So our loads and our generation is all moving toward power electronics-based generation of electrons. That's removing the mechanical inertia on the grid to maintain our frequency stability. And that's a huge challenge. How do you maintain stability when now you're generating electricity with a whole bunch of little power electronics devices like inverters on your solar panels at your house? This is this graph here. What I want to point out is it's a log on the bottom, log-based scale on the bottom, and on the left, it's you know, percent of variable generation that we put on a grid. So in the 100 kilowatt kind of scale, we've actually demonstrated that, you know, the red box here for Tau Island in the upper left, it says we have demonstrated that we can generate we can operate a grid with 100% power at an instantaneous level, approximately, let's just say 5-minute scale, more or less instantaneous. And on average for the year, we can actually operate it at 100% renewables. And it's because we have some battery storage and things like that. As the systems get bigger and bigger, we struggle with how do you run these things when you have a lot of variable generation, a lot of wind, a lot of solar, because you don't have solar, you don't have sun shining all day, you don't have wind blowing all day. You need some sort of storage to help mitigate that. So as the systems get bigger and bigger, in some cases, let's say Maui, we've demonstrated actually for the year, we can operate their grid at 36% with variable generation. But we've shown at an instantaneous level that we can actually reach 76% for a few minutes. But on average, it's still only 36%. You try to get to something huge, like the Western grid, and we've only demonstrated on the Western grid, which was, I showed in the map earlier, we can do about 10% average for the year, about 24% for instantaneous. Now, in local areas, like some parts of California, we've demonstrated much higher, but as an entire grid, it's not that high. So there are a lot of research opportunities there, and on the right is a list of some of the things that we're working on. Inertia, challenges, protection, black start, how do we restart the grid if it should go down? There's a whole process to that, and I provided congressional testimony on that about a year and a half ago. Okay, I'm gonna stop here in a second so I can pass this back to Ellen, maybe answer some questions. We're working on some, what's the future grid look like? How do we, can we, with the number of devices that are being put on the grid, I showed it in an earlier diagram, we're expecting millions and millions of devices on the grid that we've never had before. So how do you manage that? How do you operate it? How do you maintain stability and control and resilience and do it in a cyber secure way? So we've got a lot of work in that particular space. This is an example for the San Francisco Bay Area. We're anticipating we may have more than 10 million devices, control points essentially, where we're collecting information and using it to control the grid. Just in this little area, we could have over 10 million devices in the Bay Area. Compare it to the complexity of the grid today. The whole eastern grid that I showed you, there are 3 grids. The whole eastern grid has about 10,000 control points today. And we want to go to 10 million just for this little, it's a big area, but just for this densely populated area. Some things we're applying the control theories for autonomous systems to wind farms and so on, where it's increasing significantly the output of some of these systems. This is just showing on the left how right now wind turbines individually optimize, but they don't really talk to each other. And on the right, what if these turbines, each of these little arrows is a turbine, what if each of these turbines could talk to each other? They could find the wind direction much faster because they basically have an anemometer on the top and the back of these things. And you have interference from wakes created by adjacent turbines that is not taken into account as each individual turbine is trying to calculate this. All right, so I'm going to move us forward here. I'm going to stop there, actually, just in the interest of time, and pass it back to Ellen and talk a little bit about working with NREL and some of the programs we have with the universities.
Great. So I won't take a lot of time because I realize we only have 15 more minutes. But I just wanted to say, what Juan has nicely shown is the depth and the breadth of the research going on at NREL. And what's interesting about NREL is it covers a wide range of technologies and a wide range of engineering disciplines. So when you're thinking about what to do when you graduate, you can think of very broadly about how in the case of NREL, you might transition your engineering skills, whether it's in techno-economic analysis of renewable energy systems, or whether it's cybersecurity, or whether it's really basic science around how to make solar more efficient, whether it's around the energy, water, food nexus, which is also another area that NREL is growing. And what's really great to think about as a student is how you apply the engineering skills and the basic science skills you have coming out of CU, which is a top school, into working with these as as an undergraduate, which generally would be in the form of an internship. And then a lot of the people that work at NREL have graduate degrees, either master's or PhD degrees, but certainly we are really focused on our connections with universities at the undergraduate level to both help you improve your skills and the learning about the applications of what you're learning, but also to create awareness on what's possible beyond undergraduate, whether it's a master's or a PhD of that nature. And NREL really is like a university campus, I find. I haven't been there very long, and I came from Columbia University, which is a very traditional university. And NREL to me feels a lot like a university campus because there are so many really smart, creative people working with funding from Department of Energy or industry, or partnering with other universities who have National Science Foundation funding, very fundamental research, or very applied research, or even industry-focused projects. So for CU, as I said, we have a lot of research that goes on with CU. We have a lot of CU students working at NREL as either postdocs or as young scientists or as undergraduate interns. So I would encourage you, and definitely you can reach out to me if any opportunities that you're thinking about as you look at the NREL site come to mind. Definitely reach out to me. And Juan and I and others at our lab have really focused a lot as of late on how to create opportunities for, as I said, underrepresented groups. And so we have some specific programs we're building for Hispanic serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities to really try to build some solid relationships with those schools to create these opportunities for those students who otherwise may not be aware of NREL or of the wider national laboratory capacity that we have. So I'll open it up for questions now if you have, and Juan and I can try to field those together maybe.
Could you guys put your contact information in the chat, or maybe send it to Jorge, who can send it out to us?
Sure.
Sure. And I'll also point out here our website, nrel.gov, and if you're interested in internships, and we're kind of late this year for internships for this summer, and we actually are still going to field a few summer interns. Those positions typically get filled by February timeframe. So if you're interested in next year, plan ahead. Postings typically start coming out November, December, January, February.
What are you guys? Are you mainly upperclassmen, or are you just starting out?
I'm a junior.
Okay.
Nah, yeah. Also, I have another question for Juan. So you guys taught you work a lot with industry for utilities and their distribution networks, I suppose. What kind of like are you taking their information and like their energy demand and using it in your research? Is it kind of like a combined effort? Because you know there's like hundreds of different kinds of utilitors across the country. So do you kind of like conglomerate all of their data to try and get a bigger picture of what's going on the grid, or do they have a different method of helping you out?
Yeah, so great question. It's all of the above. So maybe to let you know fundamentally how we get funded.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
about 85% right now of our funding comes directly from the Department of Energy, and
Okay.
through more specifically through most of it through the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and they have research that most of it is required to be done in partnership with industry. So in that case, we're funded to work with the partner, develop maybe a new concept, demonstrate some new technology, or maybe work on some technology commercialization or something like that. And some of it is pretty deep research, though. We're doing a lot of AI-based work around getting some of these systems to communicate and work together in aggregate. For example, you have a whole bunch of solar PV systems so that they all communicate and work together. But we also have some work that is funded by industry. So in some cases, utilities come to us and they may say, hey, we've got this big problem. I'll give you an example. San Diego Gas and Electric, they have a long transmission line that feeds a community called Borrego Springs. It's not very reliable. They don't have the resources, or it's too expensive and maybe too time consuming to put in a redundant transmission line. And they just can't get the right of way. So they are looking at microgrids as an option. So we've done some analysis, we've done some engineering designs, and helped them design a microgrid. Another instance is Hawaii. So Hawaii is trying to get to 100% of their energy from renewables. And they, interestingly enough, I used to do a lot of work in Hawaii. This is the other cool part of working in the labs. I spent 4 years flying to Hawaii once a month.
Not bad.
Yeah, it was not, it sounds awesome initially, but it wears on you because the trip gets old. Yeah, there are worse places though that I've been. So, the state of Hawaii had this really lofty goal, and they don't have a lot of landmass, right? They don't have a lot of open space. It's really interesting that most of their electricity in the past was generated through diesel. Well, diesel's, one, is not clean. Secondly, it's super expensive to import diesel, right? It's very expensive. The price of electricity, I don't know if you pay your own electricity there, but I think here in Colorado, it's about 11 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. It's not super expensive. They pay anywhere from 30 to 40, even up to 45 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on which island. So you can imagine as a student I talk to people there in a studio apartment paying over $400 a month just for electricity.
Wow.
It's crazy. So, so they were moving toward more renewables. Well, they don't have the landmass to put in a bunch of large wind farms. And actually, it's interesting, most of the people live in Honolulu, in Hawaii. That's the big city. The other islands, fewer people. But it turns out most of the wind resource is not in Honolulu. Most of the wind resources, actually, wind blows really well on Maui and Molokai and Lanai. And so they're saying, well, if most of the people are on Oahu, how do we get the wind there? So that's a challenge. They were looking at undersea cable options and things like that for building, for moving the electrons from Maui or Molokai. And so then they moved toward, we got to use solar. Rooftop solar is the answer for that state. Well, they ran into challenges there because some of the older inverters, which are the boxes that convert the DC power coming out of the solar panels into AC power. You know, I talked about power electronics.
Yeah.
You know, there's a huge challenge on maintaining frequency and stability. You know, voltage, you get voltage sags and things like that. So they came to us. We actually provided some guidelines for improvements on the standards for those inverters, and did a bunch of testing here locally. We continue to do work with them. So it just depends on the problem. In some cases, these utilities come to us directly and say, hey, we'd like you to fund, or we'd like to fund you to look at a problem. In other cases, the Department of Energy comes to us and say, hey, we want you to develop a new standard or do something that's going to move the entire industry forward.
Yeah.
You know, so that's different. Where utility might want us to help us solve their specific problem. They own all the proprietary data, and we don't share it with anybody but them. But if the government funds us, then usually we share it more broadly.
Okay. Cool.
And we also work with the vendors too. In the process of, say, the inverter work, we work with all the major vendors in that area.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for the answer. Really helpful.
Sure. So other questions?
So I guess another one. With all the like new smart technology, like the smart thermostats and the smart meters in your houses, like you were mentioning how now the transformers have to accept power the opposite direction, like people can generate power in their homes. Does that like come with a lot of construction and updating of infrastructure, or is it mostly like, and the big cities already done the first time, or is that still kind of like a problem that we're facing like across the country, or is it mostly getting
the biggest challenge is this is an interesting problem. Historically, you know, if you look at the power grid, most of the attention and the understanding has been on what we call the bulk power grid. So basically the substation all the way back to the control center over the high voltage transmission lines.
Yeah.
It hasn't been till about the past 10 years that we really understood what was going on, you know, the point from the substation down to your home.
Yeah.
The way we used to understand what was happening there, this is how much the utilities really paid attention to that, is they used to have something they called an outage management system. There was no control system for what we call the distribution, you know, at the edge of the grid there near your home. And so the way they understood what was going on is people would call in and say, hey, my power's out. And they would take in all these calls and they would triangulate, oh, all these people in this neighborhood are calling, it must be this substation. And the biggest, you know what the biggest threat to the power grid at that distribution level is? There's two. Well, actually, there's three. There's storms. Always there's storms. But it's squirrels, right?
Yeah.
Squirrels and trees.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Squirrels and trees. That's what causes most of the outages down near your neighborhood. Now, if a big transmission line goes down because of a big storm, that's different. But on a daily basis, stuff like that happens all the time. Every once in a while, you have, you know, a driver might hit a substation or something like that. But, you know, where we've had to make the most change at the edge of the grid now is we're finally putting in systems to monitor and control at that level of the grid. That didn't exist. That's some of the unique capability we have at the ESIF there at NREL. We're working with utilities to manage that. In fact, this Mal is working on some of that, doing some of that work with some utilities. But you know, we're now monitoring in ways that we haven't done in the past. One of the big challenges that we have right now is protection. So a lot of our protection schemes are designed to protect the grid from, you know, over voltage, over frequency, and things like that.
Yeah.
But they're designed for electricity flowing, you know, from the big centralized plants down to the consumer. Now we also have to put in protection to make sure, you know, we don't get over voltage and over current, things like that, with generation coming from the other side as well. I apologize, that's my dog in the back. Okay, we're about close to out of time, but I'm happy to hang out if you still have any more questions.
this is one I just wanted to add out regarding also the environmental aspect of it. NREL also focuses on environmental impacts, like I said, trying to mitigate, like I said, the soil disruptions when we install all the solar panels. We have some studies that we do on that. They say that birds get struck by wind farms, so we're doing some studies there to do either radar mitigation to inform the wind turbines to shut themselves off. We're dealing with most of the power plants rely on, like that, have a pond or a lake that are next by to cool their towers. So with this global warming, what is the impact is going to realize that the cooling source is not adequate now to cool off their power towers to create more energy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, I also, I only touched on, I didn't spend a lot of time on, but a lot of my background at Sandia was in cybersecurity. It's one of the reasons I came to NREL was to really strengthen the work that we do in cybersecurity. I mentioned everything here now is power electronics based. Everything has some sort of a network connection to it. And we need to make sure that we, as we evolve our energy infrastructure, we take cybersecurity into account and we build it into the system from the beginning as opposed to bolting it on later. That's always more expensive, it's less optimal, it's more difficult. And where we're moving, I didn't go into this research, we've got some pretty deep research around design of inherently resilient systems. How do you design systems that are resilient, meaning they, you know, there's a difference between security and resilience, right? With security, you're trying to defend or protect against an external, some sort of a threat. It could be internal, like a, you know, insider, things like that. But you're trying to protect against a threat and keep it from happening. Or if it does happen, you go back and try to figure out what it was. But by that point, it's too late. You're just trying to keep it from happening again. With resilience, you make an assumption that something bad is going to happen. And what you want to do is minimize that impact. And the impact could be cost, you know, minimize the cost, minimize the downtime, and get the system, you know, maybe a graceful degradation and recovery as quickly as possible. That's a different concept, and there's not a whole lot in that area. We've been working on resilience metrics for a while. That's been a huge challenge. So NREL is a big leader in resilience systems research, energy resilience research. It's a massive opportunity as you think about where you might want to go in the future. Anything around cybersecurity, anything around resilience right now is going to give you some job security for a while.
Cool. Yeah, I never really thought of them like as two super distinct, different problems when it comes to like the power grid, but it's true, they really are kind of different.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for everything too. The presentation.
Oh, you bet.
Was really helpful. And
Yeah, sorry we couldn't do it in person.
yeah, but that's a lot of stuff now, so it happens.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Jorge, for organizing this, and Yami.
Of course, thank you guys for coming.
Yeah,
We really appreciate it.
Thanks. So hopefully that was helpful. You learned a little bit about NREL. Hopefully my story, you know, if nothing else, maybe it was entertaining. But you know, my intent was to provide some level of inspiration. But you know, a guy that couldn't even speak the language from some little town in Colorado somehow figured out how to hopefully make some difference here.
Yeah, it's quite the come up.
Structure and what we're doing. So hopefully that gives you some inspiration on the things you can do. One key thing, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of mentors, but I always had support from my parents and my grandmother. They just said, go to school. That's about the only guidance I got. But once I got to Sandia, the big difference was I got mentors. I found mentors. I had to seek them out in some cases. And I encourage you to do the same. Okay, because mentors will give you some of their experience, and maybe it'll be applicable, maybe it won't be, but they'll help you think through some things, and they may help you connect with folks. I was heavily involved. Like we didn't have SHPE, we didn't have MIAS at, it was a very small school. University of Southern Colorado is not the biggest school, in Colorado. But I was the president of the IEEE there. And through that, I was able to meet people in industry and get some leadership experience and things like that. When I was at Sandia, I was the chair of the Hispanic Leadership Outreach Committee, which is similar to what Ismail is doing for us here at NREL. And at Sandia, that was about 2,500 people at that laboratory who were part of the Hispanic community. So, I stayed engaged. You are mentors and you are role models as well. You're the future. People are looking up to you. There are kids in grade school. There are your siblings, your friends of your siblings, or people that you run into in the grocery store. They're going to be looking to you, so realize that you're a mentor. You're a mentor now, and you should always seek to find new mentors as well to help you along your career path, along your journey. So I wish you all the best. I'm here. Please reach out to us at NREL. We really want to engage more with the students there at CU Boulder. Ellen, thanks to you for helping coordinate this. Jorge, thank you so much. And Yami as well. Thanks for joining us as well as Ismail. Bill, I think, had to drop off. Bill helps coordinate a lot of
I'm still here.
Oh, Bill, there he is. All right. Bill is awesome. Diversity is very important to the laboratory, and I'm very proud to be in a position at the laboratory to raise that visibility and awareness and connection to our academic partners. So at some point when things clear up, I hope to make it out to campus as well and maybe meet some of you in person. But at some point, I would also love to have some of you students visit us and hopefully apply to some of our positions here, either as interns or as full-time employees.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.